There is a rule in political warfare that every experienced strategist understands. You do not defeat your opponent by arguing with them behind closed doors. You defeat them by changing the story that millions of people believe about them. For weeks, the White House controlled the narrative of the conflict between the United States and Canada. The message coming out of Washington was simple: Canada was the aggressor. Canada was sabotaging the American economy. Canada was weaponizing energy exports and trying to pressure the United States into submission. The story was repeated over and over again until it sounded like fact. But then something happened that Washington did not expect. The Prime Minister of Canada stepped directly into the American media arena and challenged that story in front of the people who mattered most, the American public. Mark Carney appeared on American television during prime time and did something no foreign leader had ever attempted at this scale. For 37 minutes, he presented evidence, documents, and a recording that the White House hoped would never reach the public. What started as a routine television interview quickly turned into something very different. It became a dismantling of the entire narrative coming from the Oval Office.
Millions of Americans watched as Carney calmly explained the timeline of the crisis, displayed legal rulings that contradicted the White House position, and then revealed a piece of audio that sent shockwaves through Washington. Within minutes, political reporters were scrambling, White House advisors were holding emergency calls, and Trump's allies suddenly found themselves defending statements that had just been broadcast to the entire country. But the most dramatic moment came at the end of the interview, when Carney issued a challenge that stunned the political world. A live debate, any network, any moderator, any time. One simple question directed straight at the President of the United States. If your accusations against Canada are true, why not defend them in front of the American people? What happened next may determine the future of the entire conflict between the two nations. Because sometimes the most powerful moment in politics is not when someone speaks, it is when they refuse to. And the refusal that followed may have revealed far more than the White House ever intended. The interview began with a question that sounded simple, but carried enormous weight. Anderson Cooper asked why Canada had taken such aggressive economic steps against the United States. Why respond with tariffs, energy diversification, and international pressure instead of quietly negotiating behind closed doors like allies usually do?
It was the exact question the White House wanted Americans to ask. Because if the public believed Canada had overreacted, then the entire conflict would appear justified from Washington's perspective. But Mark Carney did not treat the question as criticism. He treated it as an opportunity to reset the entire story from the beginning. He leaned slightly forward in his chair, looked directly into the camera, and delivered a calm statement that immediately shifted the direction of the conversation. Canada did not start this crisis. Those were his first words. Not a long explanation, not a complicated argument, just a clear sentence designed to stop viewers in their tracks. For weeks, Americans had been hearing that Canada was escalating the situation. But Carney presented a completely different timeline. According to him, the first move came from Washington when tariffs were placed on Canadian exports in violation of an existing trade agreement. The second move came when the White House began accusing Canada of manipulating energy supplies. The third move came when the administration threatened economic punishment if Canada refused to change its trade policies. Canada's response, he said, came only after all of those steps had already taken place. This was not just a political talking point. It was a strategic reframing of the entire conflict. If the United States initiated the pressure, then Canada's actions could be presented as defensive rather than aggressive. And Carney understood something very important about the audience watching at home. Most Americans were not following every detail of the dispute. They were hearing fragments of the story through headlines and short news segments. Whoever controlled the timeline controlled the narrative. By calmly laying out the sequence of events, Carney shifted the role of each country in the story. Canada was no longer the aggressor. Canada was the nation responding to pressure from a partner that had suddenly decided to behave like an adversary. Then came the moment that showed just how carefully the interview had been planned. Carney reached down beside his chair and pulled out a document. Not a printed summary or a prepared talking point, but the actual trade agreement that governs commerce between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. He held it up for viewers to see and opened it to a specific section, Article 2.4. Instead of speaking in complicated legal language, he explained the rule in simple terms. The agreement prohibits tariffs between the three countries unless specific emergency conditions are met. Those conditions require legal justification and review by an international dispute panel. According to Carney, the tariffs imposed by the Trump administration did not meet those conditions. Then he introduced the second document, a ruling from the dispute resolution panel that reviewed the case earlier in the year. The decision was unanimous. The panel concluded that the tariffs violated the agreement and should be removed immediately. Two documents placed side by side on live television, one showing the rule, the other showing the ruling that the rule had been broken. Carney did not raise his voice. He did not accuse the president directly. Instead, he delivered a line that landed like a quiet explosion. When the White House says Canada is acting unreasonably, they are ignoring the fact that an international tribunal has already ruled on this dispute unanimously. For millions of viewers, this was the first time they had heard about that ruling. And once the information entered the public conversation, it created a problem that the administration could not easily dismiss. Because legal decisions cannot simply be argued away. They exist as part of the official record. Carney allowed a brief pause after explaining the ruling, letting the information sink in before adding one more observation that shifted the pressure back toward Washington. If the United States expects other nations to follow international agreements, he asked, what message does it send when the United States itself ignores the rulings attached to those agreements? The question hung in the air for several seconds. It was not asked in anger. It was asked as if it were a matter of simple logic. And that is what made it so effective. Because once the audience begins to view a situation through the lens of fairness and credibility, the debate stops being about economics and starts becoming about trust. Carney understood that perfectly. The goal of the first phase of the interview was not to defeat Trump in an argument. The goal was to plant doubt in the minds of millions of viewers about the version of events they had been hearing from Washington. By the time the conversation moved forward, that seed of doubt had already begun to grow. The next topic Anderson Cooper raised was energy. The White House had repeatedly accused Canada of weaponizing its oil and electricity exports to pressure the United States. It was one of the most powerful accusations in the entire conflict because energy is something every American household depends on. If Canada was deliberately manipulating supply, it could be framed as an attack on American consumers. But Carney's response to that accusation would soon turn the entire argument upside down, and it would set the stage for the most explosive moment of the interview, the moment that would send shockwaves through Washington and force the White House into damage control before the broadcast had even ended. The conversation then moved into the subject that had been dominating headlines for weeks: energy. The White House had repeatedly accused Canada of using its energy exports as a weapon. According to statements from Washington, Canada was deliberately restricting supply and manipulating prices in order to pressure the United States during the trade dispute. It was a powerful accusation because energy is something every American family feels directly. When fuel prices rise or electricity costs increase, people notice immediately. If the public believed Canada was intentionally causing those problems, the political pressure on Ottawa would be enormous. But Carney approached the accusation in a completely different way. Instead of denying it emotionally, he broke the argument down into a simple principle that most viewers could immediately understand. Canada sells energy to the United States. It has done so for decades. Oil, natural gas, and electricity have flowed across the border as part of one of the most integrated energy partnerships in the world. But selling something to another country, Carney explained, does not mean surrendering control over that resource. Canada owns its energy reserves. Canadian companies extract them, Canadian workers produce them, and Canada decides how and where they are sold. If American buyers want Canadian energy, they can negotiate contracts like any other customer in the global market. That distinction may sound technical, but it completely changed the tone of the conversation because what Carney described next turned the accusation coming from Washington into something very different. According to him, the White House was not asking for fair trade terms. It was demanding guaranteed supply at fixed prices, while also preventing Canada from selling energy to other international markets that might offer better deals. In other words, the United States wanted the benefits of a free market when buying resources, but wanted to restrict Canada's ability to sell those same resources elsewhere. Carney summarized the issue in a sentence that instantly reframed the entire dispute. That is not trade. That is subordination. For American viewers, the choice of words was impossible to ignore. The United States was founded on resistance to economic control from another power. The idea that one country could dictate the terms on which another country sells its own resources is exactly the type of system Americans once rebelled against. Carney did not need to raise his voice or accuse anyone of bad intentions. The implication was already clear. Canada was defending its right to control its own economy. And if defending sovereignty is reasonable for the United States, then it should be reasonable for Canada as well. Anderson Cooper then asked the question that everyone watching at home was beginning to wonder. If Canada believed the White House demands were unacceptable, why escalate the situation instead of simply continuing negotiations? Why introduce financial restrictions, redirect energy exports to other markets, and begin strengthening economic ties with Europe and Asia? Was that not an aggressive move against a longtime ally? This was the moment where many political interviews turned confrontational, but Carney again answered in a way that shifted the entire focus of the debate. He explained that Canada had spent weeks trying to resolve the dispute privately. Diplomatic channels had been used, trade officials had met multiple times, proposals had been exchanged behind closed doors. But according to Carney, every attempt to negotiate had reached the same obstacle. The White House refused to remove the tariffs that had already been declared illegal under the trade agreement. Without removing those tariffs, there was no real negotiation taking place. There was only pressure being applied in one direction. Canada had two choices at that point: accept the pressure and allow its economy to become vulnerable, or take steps to protect itself. So, Canada chose protection. Energy exports were diversified toward new international buyers. Financial partnerships were strengthened with European and Asian markets, and Canada began building a coalition of allied nations concerned about the stability of international trade agreements. Carney described those actions not as punishment toward the United States, but as insurance against unpredictable policy decisions coming from Washington. Any responsible government, he argued, would do the same if faced with the same situation. At this point in the interview, the atmosphere inside the studio had subtly changed. What began as a discussion about trade policy was turning into something much larger. The focus was no longer just on tariffs or energy exports. The real question now was credibility. Could the United States still claim to be a defender of international agreements if it ignored rulings attached to those agreements? Could it demand economic loyalty from allies while simultaneously threatening them with tariffs and trade restrictions? Those were uncomfortable questions for any administration to answer. But the most dramatic moment of the interview was still ahead, because everything Carney had presented so far was based on documents, rulings, and explanations. Important information, but still within the realm of political debate. The next step would move the conversation into completely different territory where interpretation would no longer matter, because the next piece of evidence Carney introduced was not a legal document or an economic report. It was a recording of a diplomatic conversation that the White House believed would remain private. And once that audio began to play on American television, the reaction inside Washington was immediate and explosive. The moment that changed everything did not arrive with shouting or dramatic music. It arrived quietly, almost casually, in the middle of a sentence. Anderson Cooper asked a simple follow-up question. The White House has denied threatening Canada's economy directly. Officials in Washington have insisted that the administration's actions were simply part of tough negotiations. Was there any proof? Cooper asked that those threats were real. For a brief second, the studio went silent. Then Mark Carney nodded slowly and said something that immediately changed the atmosphere of the interview. Yes, there is proof. He reached down beside his chair again, but this time he did not pull out a document. Instead, he placed a small device on the table between himself and Cooper. It looked ordinary, almost unremarkable. But what happened next would soon become the most replayed political clip of the week. Carney explained that several weeks earlier there had been a diplomatic call between senior officials discussing the trade dispute. During that call, according to Carney, a statement was made that revealed the real strategy behind the economic pressure campaign against Canada. Then he pressed play. For several seconds, viewers heard nothing but the faint sound of a recorded phone connection. And then a voice entered the broadcast, a voice that millions of Americans instantly recognized. It was Donald Trump speaking during the call, and the words that followed landed like a shockwave across the political landscape. In the recording, Trump could be heard warning that if Canada refused to change its position on energy and trade, the United States would impose measures designed to, in his words, crush the Canadian economy. The phrase was not paraphrased, it was not described by a political opponent. It was spoken directly in Trump's own voice on a recording now playing across American television. Inside the studio, Anderson Cooper did not interrupt. He allowed the clip to play in full. The recording continued for several more seconds as Trump described economic pressure that could turn Canada into what he called an economic wasteland if negotiations did not go his way. When the audio finally ended, there was a pause long enough for viewers at home to process what they had just heard. Carney did not rush to comment. He allowed the silence to do the work for him. Finally, he spoke again, calmly explaining why the recording mattered so much. For weeks, the White House had insisted that Canada was exaggerating the situation. Officials repeatedly claimed that the administration had never threatened to destroy Canada's economy. They framed the dispute as normal trade negotiations. But now, millions of Americans had heard something very different with their own ears. The strategy described on that call was not negotiation, it was economic intimidation. The political impact of that moment was immediate. Within minutes, journalists across Washington began posting about the interview. Clips of the recording spread rapidly across social media platforms. Newsrooms started contacting the White House for comment, while analysts tried to confirm the authenticity of the audio. But the damage had already begun, because once a recording enters the public conversation, it becomes almost impossible to erase. Carney understood that perfectly, and he used the moment to deliver one of the most strategic lines of the entire interview. He explained that Canada had not released the recording earlier because the goal had always been to resolve the dispute privately. Diplomacy works best when leaders can speak honestly without every word becoming a headline. But once the White House began publicly denying that any threats had been made, the situation changed. According to Carney, the Canadian government believed the American public deserved to hear the truth for themselves. That explanation placed the White House in a very uncomfortable position. If the administration attacked the authenticity of the recording, it risked being proven wrong by additional evidence. But if it admitted the recording was real, it would confirm that the threats Canada had been describing for weeks were not exaggerated at all. Anderson Cooper then asked the obvious question: why reveal the recording now? Why bring it onto American television instead of releasing it through diplomatic channels or international media? Carney's answer revealed just how carefully the entire interview had been planned. He said, "The American people are the ones most affected by this conflict. Rising prices, market instability, and weakening alliances do not just impact Canada, they impact millions of Americans as well. If the dispute is shaping the future of the North American economy, then the public deserves to understand the reality behind it." It was a calculated appeal directly to the audience watching at home, not to politicians, not to journalists, but to ordinary viewers who suddenly realized they were witnessing something far larger than a typical television interview. Because what had just happened was extraordinary. A foreign leader had come onto American television and presented evidence contradicting the official story coming from the White House, and he had done it using the president's own words. But Carney was not finished. In fact, the most daring moment of the entire interview had not happened yet. Because after presenting documents, legal rulings, and now a recording that was already spreading across the internet, Carney prepared to make a move that no foreign leader had ever attempted so directly: a public challenge to the President of the United States. A challenge that would leave Trump with only two options: accept the confrontation in front of the entire nation, or refuse and explain.